So since it's morning and last day, this is going to be a little bit lighter, but I'm not sure we're happier in terms of at least the topic covered, as I'll make it clear why. So this is going to continue on even more closely on what I sort of started on Tuesday. So if you remember, I talked about this phase diagram, and I talked quite a bit about this region during that lecture. You know, gave the example of the Tiv and Lebanon, and here talked about Athens and England under the Tudors. This part I made some references, but I didn't get into too much detail, and so I want to rectify that a little bit. But now, going hopefully a little bit beyond the case study, so doing somewhat of an empirical analysis in the context of a case study. So in particular, what I want to emphasize is, you know, this sort of theme that was questioning the efficacy of top-down state building, that although something like this is possible, where, so first of all, what this is implying is that this is not possible. You don't build a state and then suddenly jump into having a very strong civil society. But the other thing that I was emphasizing, there are a lot of forces that will not even allow you to build a state very strong. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And in particular, in that lecture, briefly, I mentioned two forces. This thing, state capacity losers. Those controlling the state may not want to go all the way up here, because when doing so, they're creating an entirely new set of institutions, courts, public good provision devices, much greater regulatory capacity, and that's going to change the entire balance of society and may destabilize the economy. The other force was this resistance from local elites. In many of these places, wielding the strength of the state means you have to sort of take power away from local elites, but starting from a middle state power, that's very risky business, because they're going to fight against you. In fact, that's exactly what happened. I didn't talk about it in the context of the English case, because I was going over it slowly. But at every stage of the Tudors' efforts to strengthen the state, dispossess the monasteries, take the arms away from the barons, there were continuous uprisings. Many of them orchestrated by the very barons that felt, despite the sort of the guarantees that I mentioned that the Tudors were giving to them, that they were being dispossessed of their powers. But today I'm going to talk about another and complementary reason, and what I'm going to call this multidimensionality. So what I mean by that is that, of course, as I've emphasized several times, the state capacity is multidimensional. So this is very important. This is sort of almost the heart of what I was talking about, is that by state capacity, I do not just mean having boots, jacked boots on the ground, that you have your soldiers that can sort of kick anybody. State capacity is about military control, certainly, but also public good provision, ability of the state to be able to regulate economic activity, to having a legal structure so that you can adjudicate disputes and resolve conflicts in a peaceful manner, perhaps even go to the rule of law at some point, bureaucratic meritocracy. These are all actually things that, for instance, Max Weber, whom I understand was also faculty here, emphasized. But many state building projects are single dimensional, because the first and most important element for rulers when they are dealing with some outlying areas is to establish military control. Later on, perhaps other aspects may or may not come, but what I'm going to argue is that the process of forceful establishment of military control not only doesn't further the other dimensions, but in fact might undermine those other dimensions. And this is what I'm going to try to argue today, or at least in one specific case study, but then I'll sort of talk a little bit about the external validity of this. So what I'm going to talk about is from a sort of a very recent paper, so recent that it doesn't actually have a working paper version that's circulated, soon to be circulated version, by Leopoldo Ferguson, who is at the University of Los Andes in Colombia, James Robinson, who's at Chicago, Dario Romero, who is Dario Romero and Juan Vargas. Now this paper doesn't say too good things about the pleasures of working with me, because after we started this paper, both Dario and Juan left academia, so I'm not sure. So Dario was a RA on this project. Now he's working on AIDB, and Juan was faculty at University of Rosario in Colombia and has now gone to the private sector. So that's what happens. So what the multidimensionality is going to be developed in particular in this context, which the Colombian context, which I briefly mentioned. You know, what I mentioned just for reminders is that Colombia is remarkable in its dual structure of its sort of lack and the strength of the state. As I'm going to talk a little bit more later on, not only Colombia has a very modern economy in its major economic centers, very sophisticated courts, a constitutional court, a Supreme Court that are reasonably well functioning, very active media, bureaucrats in the center, and also a very centralized military, very strong, very centralized military in the center, but perhaps some of the outlying areas. But almost 40% of the country is also outside the control of the military, of the central state. So this has been partly because of a civil war that's been going on since the early 1960s with left-wing guerrillas, especially FARC, which is often in the news, but also another group called the ELN. But it's not just those. You know, Colombia probably has the largest number of civil wars of any country that I know. Over the last 150 years, they have, I think, about a total of 13 civil wars, which were ongoing before the FARC started its activities between liberals and conservatives, so the two different factions of the sort of essentially well-to-do economic and intellectual elite, and also the 40% of the country is now not so much under the control of the guerrillas. Guerrillas still control a few places, but really by it's dominated by right-wing paramilitaries, which were sort of a continuation of previous groups that existed, but really got activated very strongly because first the drug lords were themselves very afraid of the guerrillas because the guerrillas started capturing, kidnapping the drug lords. So they wanted to have their own protection detail, and those were the paramilitaries. And then the landowners sort of latched onto that, and many landowners started defending themselves against the guerrillas using paramilitary. So that already says something about the strength of the state at that stage of the development. But actually the real sort of jarring thing is that once the paramilitaries got formed, they became extremely active in every sphere of life in many of the peripheral areas of Colombia. But by peripheral areas, I don't mean like very far. You know, some of those are really 100 miles away from Bogota, and I'll actually talk about one of them in the context of the case study in a second. So now they run drugs. They have a huge protection racket. They displace peasants from valuable land. They set up checkpoints. And they get money for vaccination, which means they vaccinate you by protecting you, and therefore other people don't come and shake you down. But of course, vaccination turns out to be very expensive. So they have lots of different rackets of dispossessing and stealing from the general public. And the remarkable thing is that they do this in front of the eyes of the military. So you have these cases where you know, there's a military barracks, and then the military are staying in. They're not doing anything. They're extremely well armed, extremely strong, but they just don't bother. They stay there. You know, half a mile away from it, the paramilitaries set up these checkpoints and shake down people. So this is, or displace people from entire villages because those lands are quite valuable. They want to take it over and sell, etc. So this is a very, very weak state, and it's always been a concern of people, you know, in the major cities and also voters all around the country. Some, as I'm going to talk again, also many parts of the Colombian electorate are, especially those from indigenous backgrounds, but poor backgrounds and outlying areas, are very disillusioned with the state. But still, there is a even much greater disillusionment, dissatisfaction with the paramilitaries and the guerrillas, of course. So especially over the last 20 years, there have been increasing mounting pressure from the voters. I should also say, throughout this period, from the 1960s onwards, there has been no other actual civil wars between factions of the elite. So the only sort of civil war-like activity has been this fighting between guerrillas and the state. No fighting between the paramilitaries and the state, very interestingly. So now that the paramilitaries, despite the fact that they're actually stronger than the guerrillas. But during this period, every election has been run in normal terms. So there has not been a coup. So on the facade, Colombia is actually a democracy as well. Well, there have been two sorts of irregularities in this democracy, again, in the places that are where the paramilitaries are strong. First of all, especially in the 1980s, late 1980s and the late 1990s, all socialist candidates were murdered. And the second, later in the 1990s and especially 2000s, there was a lot of coerced voting and ballot stuffing, etc. Again, not in Bogota and Cartagena and places like that, but in these places that were under paramilitary control. So there have been irregularities of potentially quite consequential nature, but at least people in Bogota, Cartagena, and so on and so forth, they vote, and whichever ballots are counted, whoever has the most votes gets elected, and so on and so forth. So when the voters have been, yes, please, yes, Mark.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure, of course.
Microphone, please.
Since it's so central to what you're talking about, I, to some degree, fail to see the difference, especially the cases that you're giving. Fail to see the difference between what you call Area 1 and 3. So what's the big defining difference between the paper Leviathan and what you call Region 1, which I think the example that you gave is Lebanon, right?
Right. So I guess Lebanon is a more complicated example. So but let me talk about the TIV, and then I think, so what's distinguishing about the TIV is that the TIV start with a very weak state and very sort of strong social norms that empower some traditional clan-based or tribal sort of institutions. And it is these institutions that stop the state from getting off the ground. So they don't even have a centralized state, or in the Lebanese case, it's extremely weak. So in this case, you have a centralized state that's very strong in certain spheres, but it doesn't go all the way to building the sort of the Weberian state. So the what the state you see in Bogota, or the state you see in Pakistan, you see in Lahore or Islamabad, has a lot of things that we associate with modern states. It has a very strong army. It has a parliament, or the parliament doesn't so matter, but it has executive control, secret service, and all of the things that the US or Germany would also have. But then it leaves half of the country outside its control. It doesn't invest in providing public goods. It doesn't even sort of establish the monopoly of violence. So that's but the important thing is that in both cases the state doesn't develop to its full capacity. So there is some important similarity.
Wouldn't that also count for Beirut and the rest of the country?
Not exactly to the same extent that I understand, in the sense that it's not that Beirut is, Beirut has exactly the same sort of structure, in some sense, that the Hezbollah is extremely active in Beirut, and the similarity. Lebanon is a more complex case. You're absolutely right, but the similarity that I was drawing there is that it's this entire society itself, these 18 ethnic groups, for example, that don't want the state to become stronger, because they're afraid that once the state becomes stronger, they're not going to be able to control it, because one of the other ethnic groups is going to take control of it, and that's going to be all hell breaks loose. So now the little history is over, so we're coming to the most important part. So there's been this discontent with, of course, this situation, and the voters have been demanding more and more accountability. So essentially, what happened is that in the 1999, the president, Pastrana, started, who was a conservative, but he started a peace process with FARC. So that was supposed to sort of bring FARC into the sort of legitimacy, stop all the attacks, kidnapping, fighting, and so on and so forth. But as many of these peace processes, it was a messy affair, and it did not have the support of many different parts of the country. Especially, there were parts of the country where landowners or other groups were previously very much tormented and killed and kidnapped by the guerrillas, or where there was a fear that the FARC, it wasn't clear where this whole negotiation would go, and FARC has always wanted land reform, and then there was also fears of land reform. So all of this there was quite a bit of sort of resistance against it. One of those places is Antioquia, which is a major, backward but major state department in Colombia. So leading this sort of opposition was a politician from Antioquia, Governor Alvaro Uribe, and then he sort of started running as an anti-peace campaign against for presidency. At this time, presidents are term limited to a single term, so it wasn't Pastrana running, but his successor, I forget who now. But essentially, FARC killed its own peace process, with which it was not very committed. It actually hijacked a plane at this point in time. So, FARC during the peace process still, there were flourishes of kidnappings lower than before, but this was sort of a major event because nothing like this had happened during the peace process. Totally changed the dynamics, and Alvaro Uribe got elected with a law and order platform against all armed groups, but really that meant the FARC because he had quite close relations with some paramilitary groups at least. Okay, so so this you can see the other things that I mentioned, FARC and ELN. This is where the right-wing paramilitaries especially become organized under auto-defense groups. So once Uribe got elected, he had, what he's going to see, he's going to try to do is he's going to try to strengthen the state, in particular to eliminate FARC. So I think he was quite committed at some level to eliminating FARC. He may not have been totally committed to sort of eliminating the paramilitaries, and in fact later on there's a lot of evidence that he gave a pass to some paramilitary groups, etc. But he was very committed to eliminating the FARC. How was he going to do that? Well, he was going to do that with a single-dimensional top-down state building. And so the point I'm going to argue is that this did and could, not only could, but in this instance did backfire, and then we're going to look at the variation to understand how it backfired and what we can learn from it. So in particular, Uribe adopted two central strategies for doing that. Both of those are going to play a role in what I'm going to talk about soon, now. One is that he increased the size of the military fighting the guerrillas. So, of course, the first top-down thing you can do is bigger army, more jackboots on the ground to deal with it. Now, this is not going to play much of a direct role in what I'm going to do, but it plays one important role. So essentially, in Colombia, brigades are run by military sort of details. Rick can help me with these things. Are not always that good. But brigades are supposed to be, in Colombia, as in many other places, to be led by generals. But, he increased the military so much that there weren't enough generals around right away. So there were a lot of colonels starting leading brigades. So that's an important detail that will play a role in a second. Typically, colonels, and again, I don't know whether this is the case in many other armies, but it turns out that colonels in Colombia, there are many of them, and generals, there are very few. So, and it turns out that most military careers end as a colonel. So it's like the sort of the hardest step to get promoted from. So that's an important detail. We're going to come back to that. The second is that he decided that the way to fight the military, the guerrillas, you create stronger incentives for the military. So military, as I said, is a very strong institution. There's very little civilian control of the military. We'll come back to that in a second. Very little civilian oversight. But the military are not always very committed. So Uribe decided, with some justification, I guess, not totally crazy, that these military are doing only a half-hearted effort to fight the guerrilla. They don't want to go into the jungles where they can get killed and it's very unpleasant. They sit in their barracks and enjoy the relatively high salaries by Colombian standards. So he increased incentives in a number of dimensions. So first, and this plays a role too, he provided lots of incentives to informants and civilians to provide information to the military on guerrillas. Actually, supposedly on all armed groups, but it was really directed at guerrillas. And second, he introduced lots of incentives for the military itself. So many of these were through secret directives, but some of them did not remain so secret, so we have some records, and I'll go through them. So essentially, he gave big pots of money to generals or to commanders. They could use that money through essentially no accounting, no reporting necessary. They could use it in whichever way they want. Potentially give it to informants, or they could give it to their own soldiers, even though soldiers were not supposed to be paid for doing their job. So, and there's a lot of evidence that soldiers got paid for doing good things, meaning killing guerrillas, and soldiers got lots of perks, a lot of vacation time, much better conditions, and promotion. So especially lots of colonels got promoted to general for doing their job and killing guerrillas. So these were all sort of new incentives that were being provided, and I'm going to document some of those. So what that meant is that there were very strong incentives both at the bottom of the military hierarchy. Soldiers wanted to kill guerrillas, and from the colonels up down, the colonels started putting a lot of pressure on their captains and lieutenants to say, go and kill guerrillas. What? You're not killing enough guerrillas? My promotion's on the line. So what happens in such a situation? One thing, collateral damage, and I mean literally here. So, but actually, the evidence that later got uncovered was that, and I'll talk about that a little bit before I sort of go into the empirical evidence, is that this wasn't just collateral damage, but there was what Colombians got to call falso positivos, so which is actual civilians, peasants, being killed and being dressed up as guerrilla so that the incentives are received. So what I'm going to show you is three things after I document this. This is the sort of case study part. And then empirically what I'm going to show you is that this was more likely, quite a bit more likely, when agents' incentives were stronger, brigades commanded by colonels motivated by career concerns, and where institutional checks in the form of judicial oversight were weaker. And then I'm also going to show you that exactly like along the lines of what I claimed, but all of this is circumstantial evidence, but fits with what I claimed, that when this happened, not only this was not very effective in fighting the guerrillas, but also it led to a persistent future worsening in judicial quality and security situation in these areas. Okay, so those are what I'm going to try to show. Any questions? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to document how this incentives were gotten stronger, and then I'm going to try to, some Western audiences, the only one time else I've presented, been done one time that James Robinson presented, the experience that both of us had is that Western audiences are a little bit incredulous that people can be killed, innocent people can be killed and dressed up by as guerrillas by soldiers. But so that's what I'm going to document a little bit. Okay, so there has been something like a false positive in Colombia for a long time, but it was very, very sort of sporadic, and there's a huge increase. And this increase, so just to show you, this is a Google search of the word falsos positivos, false positives. And there's essentially no mention of this in Google in Colombia. And then there's a peak here, because this is the first time that in a place very near Bogota, where is it? Here. Actually, I don't know where. Yes, here. There's a place called Socha, very near Bogota, essentially less than 100 miles. And so there, the military killed civilians, dressed them up as guerrilla, and but it's sort of sufficiently near. There was a big hoopla about it, so journalists came. It's very easy from Bogota to come. Local journalism is very weak in Colombia in many of these outlying areas. Journalists came, they took pictures. You know, the biggest daily started breaking the news. It became a big deal. So this was in 2008, and that's where you see this increase in 2008. So, but I'm going to show you that this has been going on since 2003, essentially. So as soon as this started, all of these secret directives were being pulled. So the 2008 is going to be the end of the treatment, so to speak. So, okay. So here is the actual data that has been uncovered by various organizations. So I'll talk about two reports in particular, one by Human Rights Watch, one by the UN Commission. This and the NGOs have been doing a lot of the digging and finding out these numbers. Of course, there's some measurement error here, but this is how the data goes. So, you know, they're about, this is by quarter. Before this date, there's some, perhaps 5 or 4 killings that could be counted as false positives for other reasons in Colombia. This number sort of shoots high up, and this is during this entire period, there is about 1,200 false positives. So there's 1,200 people, according to these UN and Human Rights Commission reports, that were killed and who were peasants or other innocent people and who were dressed up as guerrilla. So what I'm going to do is in my empirical specifications, I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to use this this blue area as the period in which there were incentives for producing killings. And this is the period where career concerns and judicial efficiency, etc., all of these things are going to come into play. But as you can see, it sort of starts out slow with the directives, builds up, builds up, builds up. So you might think that the dummy version here may not fit very well. So I'll also show you one where you have a linear incentives where it kind of goes up and then stops abruptly in starting in 2009. So I'll show you the 2 of them. You'll see they give very similar results quantitatively, but of course their implications for the time path are somewhat different. So they have a pre-treatment period, post-treatment period, so we can do a bunch of things. And here actually I'm showing 2 things. One is cases. It just counts if in a quarter, in a semester. This is quarter, but in the data when I go to the municipality level data, they're about as I showed you yesterday, they're about going to be 1,100 municipalities. I'm going to do semesters, 6 monthly periods. So what I was going to say, yeah. So the case is going to be if in a semester, in a 6-month period, there was an incident of a false positive, it's a dummy. Executions or killings just counts how many people are killed. Okay. Now, true positives. This is very interesting. So this is actually the number of actual killings of guerrillas. When the false positives start increasing, the army actually starts killing actual guerrillas. And it goes down all the way. Interesting. Anyway, so this is one of the secret directives that later was leaked to the Colombian press. It says it gives the director, what did it say? Secret Ministry of Defense. This is a 2005 directive, sort of encouraging and making the funds available and the rewards available and so on and so forth. Now, the important thing is I emphasize military personnel were not explicitly excluded, so they can be paid. There needed no authorization ex ante by superior officers for operations or rewards, and posterior intelligence could be used to justify the killings. That was one of the directives also. So I could kill somebody and then say, well, I wasn't sure at the time, but look, he's a guerrilla. So that was very important. So many things that people got: medals, promotions, days off, holidays, sent platoons to Sinai, etc. So as I said, they start falling in 2008. So here are some pictures from these are from the Human Rights Watch report, but there are similar ones from the UN report. So these are some of the people that were recovered as guerrilla. and count as false positives. So this is a particular gentleman who is wearing boots, military boots. So that's a telltale sign that he's a guerrilla, except that he's wearing the left foot on his right foot and the right foot on his left foot. So this is another guerrilla who is carrying his grenades hanging outside. Of course, that's impossible to do because you blow yourself up. This is another guerrilla who is holding an attack rifle, but except that he's holding the attack rifle like this, which means he can never fire it. So, if you really were caught with attack rifle, your finger would be on the trigger. So there were a lot of these cases that were sort of documented, and Human Rights Watch, which is sort of a advocate group, was very strong, documenting both the extent of the killing, and the Human Rights Watch really went after the generals. He said it's the generals and the colonels that are responsible. The Colombian military was very much responsible. It was all happening under their knowledge and documented case after case after case. It's a very long report. But some people here may not fully trust Human Rights Watch. I think they are actually extremely accurate in general. But these events were big enough that UN sent a special commission led by a former high-level diplomat, and the UN report comes to exactly to the same conclusions, that they are a little bit more guarded in terms of the role of the military as an institution, but they document all the false killings. They talk about many generals and many colonels being involved in these things, etc. So let me give you a little bit of the case study evidence, just because it at least makes the case. So, for example, after there weren't many cases that were tried even after all of these things, and that's one of the things that really both the UN report and the Human Rights Watch report are extremely critical of. But there are a few cases that were tried, and the reason they were not tried is that despite a lot of the efforts by the civilian government, the reach of the civilian oversight is very limited. But so this is one guy, Captain Valbuena. He testifies, and he says that his former commander of the brigade, which was a colonel then promoted to general, says his only objective was to gather enough statistics to be able to be promoted to general. Another colonel was expelled 27 soldiers from his brigade for not killing 2 people who were actually dressed as civilians, and there was no evidence against them. And the soldiers, now in this case not this captain, so when my colonel came and he started insulting us for scolding us, told us we were no good for nothing, that we did not understand that a guerrilla member alive was useless for him, and that what mattered were killings because he was going to be promoted to general. And now he's compromised. So those sort of cases are extremely common, and were the most important reason. Actually, today, top rank generals in Colombia, many of them were colonels during this period. So the military is in fact not very willing to investigate any of these issues. So the Alston, this is the UN report. There were at the end of all this hoopla of the 1,200 cases of killings. So this is what just saying this because this sort of actually emphasizes that these numbers were not made up. So these are actually the false positive numbers that were serious enough that there were, almost all of them. So out of 1,185, 1,056 of them were referred to all the way to the Attorney General, but only 16 of them were cleared because the military did not cooperate and the limited ability of the civilians to try the military personnel. Okay. Again, so more Human Rights Watch stuff. Let me sort of skip that. One final slide before I go to the empirical work or the data. Well, actually, theory. I'm going to provide a little bit of theory, but nothing new, just to frame the discussion, and then I'll go to the empirical work. So, by the way, this is not totally unique to Colombia. One of the main problems in Ferguson, Missouri, that led to this very tense relations between the police and the black community was the behavior of the police, and this is from a investigation of the Ferguson Police Department by the Department of Justice. that officer evaluations and promotions depended on productivity, meaning number of citations, and officers just made up things, and they just essentially saw, especially the African American community, as a pool that they could just issue citations to in order to get promoted. And there's a similar issue actually in Vietnam by the US military. They were also incentivized on the body count, and there is evidence, although not always very clearly investigated in that case also, that they killed some civilians in order to be able to report that they were successful. All right. Okay. So since I've been emphasizing multidimensionality, high-powered incentives, and I said I'm going to give a not original model in order to frame the discussion, you should have guessed that I'm going to talk about multitasking. So I'm going to give a very simple multitasking model, because this just very much sounds like multitasking. I want Davide to do one thing, I give him incentives, but instead of that, he does something else and he pretends it's doing what I want him to do. Okay. So here is the multitasking model. A principal is going to set a linear incentive. So this is the standard linear incentive. I'm just going to assume it in a static setting, but this was sort of derived by Holmstrom and Milgram from a dynamic Brownian motion process. The agent's going to exert two types of efforts, good effort and bad effort. Good effort is what you do to go after the guerrilla. Bad effort is what you do to go after the civilians, and so that you can find them in some quiet place. Actually, by the way, there are two essential ways of, I forgot to say, in which the civilians were killed. One is, just you found some small group of civilians that were walking to their field, or they were walking to some place in an isolated area, and you killed them. So, but that was actually only some part of it. The other one, which actually left even more of a trail at the end, is that they actually worked with local groups, some of them paramilitaries, and put ads in order to get civilians for a job. They put them in trucks, drove them away, and killed them. So both of those require effort. So that's the AT. Okay. And then this is going to produce false positives and true positives. True positives are actual guerrilla killed. False positives are civilians killed and dressed up as guerrilla. Now, I'm going to assume, I think quite reasonably, and I think this is important, because even with all the sort of case study evidence that I have given you, you might still think, oh, these are called false positives, but perhaps a lot of them are just collateral damage. Perhaps they really got confused. They thought these were guerrillas, etc. Just like the argument is, yeah, sure, Michael Brown may have been unarmed, but there was such a tense situation that there's no way the police officer could have known that he's unarmed. So what I'm going to assume is that if you put good effort, you get some noisy output, true killings. If you put good effort, you also get some false killings. That's the collateral damage. So chi is the collateral damage parameter. So imagine, here I have normalized this coefficient to 1. So imagine if I put 1 effort, I get 1 on average true killings, but perhaps I get 0.1 false killings. And then I could put intentional bad effort. Okay. As usual, these are normal, etc., etc. Okay? And then these guys are paid some incentives, which I'm going to assume to be linear. So linear is not a crazy assumption for the lower guys. The better they did, the more promotions, the more the days off, etc. they got. For colonels, perhaps it's a 0-1 promotion, but let me not get into that. So there's some transfer, which I'm not going to endogenize, so this is not going to be, I'm not going to worry about the optimal contract. But I'm going to assume that these are national incentives that are being set, and this pi is, so this S is what the national incentives are introduced. This pi is going to be, in some sense, is how sensitive you are to the national incentives. So if you are a very secure general and you don't really want to get promoted anymore, and you don't have other reasons to sort of have a lot of accolades created through killings, pi is going to be very small for you. If you're going to be a colonel, then pi is larger, so these national incentives are going to matter more for you. Okay, By the way, in this whole exercise project, and that's why it took a while with lots of people collaborating on this, we did not get any support or data from the Colombian military. I wonder why. But so we had to get all of these data retrospectively by scraping military websites. So which means that there are some limits to our data, but we were able to classify all of the brigades commanders as colonel or general. But we can't pursue their careers later on because the army only lists brigades commanders. It doesn't list all of the commanders that are in administrative posts. Okay, and this is the cost function. So there's some costs that are quadratic. So doing a little bit of each may not be that expensive. But then there is also this complementarity or substitutability term. Delta positive means this is effort substitutes, meaning the more AF you put, AT is more expensive. The more AT you put, AF is more expensive. Delta negative means the complements case. If you do more AT, you can also do more AF. So this would be the case, for example, where because I'm going after the guerrillas very effectively, working very hard, I also have a lot of opportunities to kill civilians who are in the neighborhood. So that would be the complements case. This one would be where, because I'm going after the guerrillas in the jungle, there are not that many civilians in the jungle, so I can't find all that many civilians. But if I want to go after the civilians, I go and do these hiring schemes, and of course I'm wasting all my time with that rather than going and killing guerrillas. And then people maximize this Kara preferences, as I've indicated, and then you find AT star and AF star. So then you can have the expected value of QT star, expected value of QF star, and then we can sort of look at, one thing else that I was going to mention. Sorry, this is very important. I forgot to mention it. All right. So from these unobserved efforts, we're going to get true and false positives. So this is where one more parameter is going to come in, and this is the judicial system. So imagine that you have actually, either as collateral damage or as intentional killings of civilians, you've killed some civilians. But if you get caught doing that, you're not going to get promoted. In fact, you're going to get punished. So there's some parameter which says once you do these false killings, are you rewarded for it or not? So that parameter is going to be alpha. So what that means is that higher alpha means it's going to be easier for you to masquerade false killings as true killings. So what is alpha? Well, I'm sure there are lots of different sort of alphas that could matter. For example, right now we're in the process of trying to get local media. It's very difficult because there's very little local media and there is no centralized database. So we're going municipality by municipality and trying to see if there are active newspaper offices based in that municipality. And we might try to get some data on that. You know, we might succeed to get some data. We're trying, but we may or may not succeed to have a complete series of that. But one other thing is that, you know, as I said, the judiciary, civilian judiciary, has limited control. But it's a turf war, and continuously in places where the judiciary is actually well organized, they try to look into such cases because they claim, in some cases, they've claimed that these are civilians. If they are killed, then the local civilian judiciary has authority over it. In other places, the judiciary is so overwhelmed, so lack of independence. The local police force is totally afraid of the military, which is a much stronger institution, that they don't touch it. So to try to do that, what we do is we construct a judicial inefficiency index. And I'll sort of describe that. So that's going to be our alpha. All right. So here are some very easy comparative statics. In fact, since time is running short, let me just skip this first one, which is not so important. Let me look at the effect of higher pi, which is, imagine that we increase S, which is what, from the directives and from all that evidence I've argued, happens between 2003 and 2008, inclusive in Colombia. So now let me compare two places. One municipality where the relevant brigade has career concerns, the other one it doesn't. What's the effect? Well, nothing surprising here. If the relevant kernel has carrier concerns, high or pi, then there will be both more true positives and more false positives. And the only case in which either of these two effects can be zero rather than strictly positive if the relevant effort is equal to zero. Okay, so that's very simple. But what it implies is that as a main effect, we should see a bigger impact on false positives, potentially also a bigger impact on true positives relative to other places in high carrier concern places. Okay? So far, these comparative statics don't distinguish false and true positives. So if your belief is still collateral damage, with these results, the only thing I have to convince you is the case study evidence, Human Rights Watch report, etc. But when we come to the alpha, it's a little bit more interesting. So essentially, when we do the comparative static of alpha, meaning now, again, I'm looking at the national incentives having gone up. So comparing, say, the 2003 period, 2003 to 2008 period to the pre-period or the post-period, then I should have more positives in places where judicial efficiency is lower. But also, the effect on true positives could be the opposite. So in other words, in particular, what happens is that if delta is actually negative, then you're always going to have that true positives behave like false positive. Remember, what is it? Delta negative means the two are complements. If the two are complements, you can do false positives when the true positives is also going on, then true positives just behave like false positives. But the more realistic case, as I've already indicated from the time series also, is that they are actually substitutes. You do one, you specialize one into the other. When they are substitutes and that substitute effect is sufficiently strong, what happens is that when I make efficiency of the judicial system worse, now the false positives become more attractive, so you start shifting away and away from true positives. So in that case, you can get a negative or a zero correlation. So that's one observable difference between the true and the false positive, between the collateral damage and intentional false positives. And we'll see that, in fact, that's the pattern in the data. Yes, Ray?
Could you get a corner solution?
Yes.
It's cheaper to get the
right.
Right?
Sure.
The real gurus. So why would they bother with the real gurus?
Right. Well, so in the model, you don't necessarily get a corner solution, but you may. And the reason why you don't get a corner solution is because of this quadratic term. So essentially, that's why delta need not be too small. If delta is very small, or it could be, it could be too small, but if the delta is too small, you'll never get a corner solution. But if delta is sufficiently large, and you are in the substitutes case, then you do get a corner solution, or you could get a corner solution. If delta is equal to 0, for example, there's neither substitutes nor complements, then this implies that there's another condition. So the derivative at 0 is 0, so you will always put both types of effort. All right. One final result. What about the level of utility? And now here it's important that I'm not endogenizing T. If I endogenize the level of transfer, the intercept of the salary schedule, then I would also have an insurance term because of that, etc. But I'm not doing that. So what I'm doing is I'm saying, what's the effect of these parameters on U? The level of utility. Now, they're all actually ambiguous, but they're ambiguous in a way that you can sign very easily. And the ambiguity is very clear. If I increase alpha, I'm just focusing on alpha here, okay? If I increase alpha and there are these incentives going on, and you are doing true positives, that's actually sort of a complex effect on you. It's better because you make some mistakes that are going to be able to sort of be masqueraded, but it then changes the effectiveness of your effort, etc. On the other hand, if you are doing false positives, alpha is always good for you. So in other words, if there is sufficiently high false positives here relative to these variance terms, because it's creating more variability, then necessarily greater alpha is better for you, which means your utility is greater in places where the institutions are weaker. So this we take as a force towards saying that the military, which was a very powerful institution, in particular had a lot of control over the police, and in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases like over the judiciary, could even have a negative impact on the quality of the institutions. And in fact, that's one of the most interesting things I'm going to show you. All right, we're done. So now I actually went over this. The Human Rights Watch report and the NGO CNEP are where we got a lot of the data. There were 1,500 actually victims from 1988 to 2011. During the time window that I'm talking about, which is 2003 to 2008, there are 1,182. And that's the 10,056 of them went to the Attorney General all the way up. Identifying army ranks, this is where we go to the Wayback Machine of the internet. We go through all of the pages of the Colombian military in order to be able to identify these things. Finally, judicial efficiency, or sorry, judicial inefficiency, since alpha, the comparative statistics in the model are alpha, so we do think alpha. It's not an easy measure to construct because you don't have very detailed data. But one thing we have is we have complaints from against all civil servants, although it could include some complaints about harassment that are not against civil servants too, coming from every municipality per year. And we also have a breakdown of these, so we can, and they're very different across municipalities because some municipalities, people are better integrated with Bogota, so they can complain more, etc. So what we do is that we take the fraction of complaints against the quality of the judiciary. They're corrupt, they're inefficient, they're doing the wrong job, as relative to all complaints, and that's going to be our measure of judicial inefficiency. We're going to use this both in a time-varying and time-invariant fashion, but to start with, just let me focus on the time-invariant fashion, okay, which is the more interesting case. Okay. Now, this is a very long equation, which is not great, but this is the equation we're going to estimate. So let me go through the terms, and then it's going to be very easy to understand things. Okay. So YMT is our outcome variable. It's either false positives or true positives. And in both cases, there are also zeros. So things are bad in Colombia, but not that bad that every municipality has false killings. So as I said, there are about 1,000 municipalities, and there are about 1,200 false positives during this window. So that means most semesters, most municipalities have a 0 false positive. So therefore, what we do is we do log of 1 plus, but we do other specifications, so the functional form doesn't really matter that much. So throughout, we're going to have a full set of time effects and a full set of municipality fixed effects. In addition, a major concern could be, and is, that these municipalities are not that similar to each other. So throughout, what we're going to do is we're going to include a whole host of covariates, soil quality, historical variables, population variables, etc. We fully control for population, quadratics or quartica, etc. But also, almost all of these covariates, except for population, we also fully interact with time. So for example, soil quality dummies, they are, I think, 16 or something like that of them. And then so each dummy is estimated and then fully interacted with, each dummy is multiplied by a full set of semester dummies, and those are what's estimated. So you allow very flexible differential trends by municipalities as a function of their covariates. In addition, it's not shown here, but I'm going to show you in a table in a second, we also allow, for robustness check, linear municipality time trends. Yes, Ray?
Did you have data on the number of
microphone, please.
Sorry.
Oh, yes.
Did you have data on the number of guerrilla incidents? Because
Yes.
if they're killing...
Yes.
Oh, you did. Okay.
So one of the covariates included and interacted with time is the pre-event average attacks by guerrilla, attacks by paramilitary, etc. I should have said that. Good question. In addition, we have dummies for a municipality being led by a kernel, because it's a time varying variable. Sometimes you're led by a kernel, your brigade, sometimes not. So it's not absorbed by this delta M. And judiciary inefficiency. Now, I've written this out, but we're not going to have a dummy for that because we take the time invariant version of that. But in addition, and these are the key things, we include a set of, just one second and I'll come to that. We include a full set of interactions of the high-powered incentive period and the immediately prior 2 semesters and the immediately posterior 2 semesters interactions. So in other words, what is this? We interact IM0, yes, that's right. IM0, which is this baseline judicial inefficiency with the 2002 first semester and 2002 second semester. It is wrong, sorry. It should be 2002:2. 2002 first semester and 2002 second semester dummy. So we look at whether there are differential trends just the 2 semesters before. And we do the same thing for kernels, and then we also do the same thing for the 2 post semesters where after the incentive stopped. And then the key treatment variable for us, this is a pre-trend check. This is not a check because it could be a persistent effects, but I'm going to show you what happened. And the 2 key variables for us is that there is a treatment variable, HPT, and that's interacted with the kernel and the judicial efficiency. So the theoretical predictions were that these things should be positive for true and false positives. This thing should be positive for false positives, and it could be 0, especially in the collateral, if it's an intentional false positive. Okay, so yes, please.
So just a question for clarification. So there's just one brigade in each municipality here?
No, that's a great question. So I should have specified that in some municipalities there are 2 brigades, or there are multiple brigades, because they're mobile brigades that are, that cover bigger regions. So far, these specifications I have shown you are the ones where we have a dummy. So if any of the brigades is led by a kernel, we've done it with a fraction led by kernels, and the results are very similar, but I don't have those results here. That's a very good question. I should have clarified that. All right. Okay. That's some summary statistics. Let me skip that. These are more important summary statistics, so let me show you. So as I've told you, the mean of these variables is small. Many municipalities have 0 false positives, but you can see already that it increases significantly. So before 2003, there is essentially a trivial amount of this stuff going on, 0.011. It increases 8-fold during this period, but more importantly, there's a very large increase in standard deviation. It falls in some places and not others. Actually, true positives, as I also showed you, goes down during this period. There were on average 4 killings per semester of true guerrilla in the pre-2003 period, and then it goes down to 1.5 or 1.7. By the way, I should have said that. I did say that. I don't know. This regression is run between 2000 and 2010. So we have a total of 6 semesters before the treatment starts. 4 of those we use as baseline, and these 2 here we use as check for pre-trends. Okay. All right, so here is the specification. And then remember, we're going to have 2 specifications, the dummy incentives or the linear incentives. Okay, so here is essentially the structure of the result. All of these come from a single regression. So each column here is a single regression. As you can see, cases and casualties, they're very, very similar. I'm not going to talk about both of them. So let me instead talk about the casualties regression. So what this says is that first, you have these 4 pre-trend variables. Judicial inefficiency interacted by first semester and second semester 2002. Judicial inefficiency interacted first semester, second semester 2002. And either the linear incentive structure or the dummy structure. And what you see is that there is generally not a pre-trend. There is not much that's going on that's significant either numerically or standard error-wise. So places with differential judicial inefficiency and differential treatment of colonel versus generals don't really behave very differently. There's a slight exception here, which is significant at 10%, but it's not robust. It sort of disappears. Not much going on before the pre-trend. All of these, just one second, all of these specifications, we have 900 municipalities. We've lost about 200 municipalities. All of these specifications have these control times time effects, as I've indicated. And then the key variables are these incentives interacted with judicial inefficiency and kernel. And this is exactly the pattern that you find that exactly a priori we should have expected, given the multitasking logic. There's a very significant, statistically, and we'll see quantitatively very large in 2 slides, effect that in places where judicial inefficiency is higher, you have a bigger increase in false positives, and in places that are led by kernels, you have a bigger increase in incentives. This coefficient numerically is bigger than this coefficient, but it doesn't mean anything because judicial inefficiency is a continuous variable and the other one is a dummy. Yes, please?
So, of course, those numbers look like to be in line with the theory, but if you think about the measure of judicial inefficiency, wouldn't you expect that if you have a very corrupt municipality, like mafia-like judiciary, then it would be very risky to complain about this judiciary?
Yes.
And
exactly.
that would mean that then you would actually, if it's very bad, then you might.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think you're right. But 2 things. First of all, to some extent, that's consistent with by judicial inefficiency. I want to capture institutional insecurity that's going to make it very difficult to investigate something. But second, remember everything is relative to other complaints. So it's a low one means I'm not complaining about the judiciary, but I'm still complaining about bureaucrats, or the police. So I'm not sure. But even if that's the case, I think that's fine for my general interpretations. I'm not really saying that it's really the judiciary. Although in general cases, it's this police called Fiscalia, which is attached to the judiciary. That's the one that really has any ability to do anything to the military. But yes. 2 other things I want to say. First of all, from this table, this is very consistent across different specifications. And in particular, it continues to be consistent when you include the post terms. Now, this we did not have any prior on. One thing I should also say, the linear specification, if anything, fits better, slightly better. I mean, it's not a big effect, but if you look at the t statistics, this one has a t statistic of about 4, this one has a t statistic about 3. So the linear one fits better, which is again consistent with what you might have expected because this issue is getting bigger and bigger over time. But it's cut extremely abruptly. It goes on, and then the moment that these things become on the press and the judiciary gets exercised and the national press is all over it, there's immediate cessation. Nothing in 2009, nothing in 2009. So we did not. I mean, we could have persisted, but that's what you see. So this is now true positives. Theory was suggesting that there should be a positive effect. Again, not much of a pre-trend. There's a little bit here again, which is not which disappears in many specifications and will totally disappear when we put municipality linear time trends in 1 second. But there is again a positive effect from kernels. So where you have career concerned agents, they do more of the right thing also, as you should have expected. If they didn't, that would be weird. But the judiciary interaction is no longer there. In non-specification is judiciary interaction. So again, there shouldn't be this sort of very strong judiciary interaction in the case of true killings. Miraculously it works. Perhaps too good to be true. I don't know. All right. Well, let me actually show you. This is size of the one other specification. Oh, why? All right. Oh, yeah. This is one I wanted to show you. Sorry. And then I'll go back. I don't know. I thought this was right after my main specifications, but somehow it's shifted around. So this is the same specifications that I'm showing you now, in addition to all of these time-varying control effects, which allow for differential trends already, but parameterized differential trends. Now we allow linear municipality fixed trends. So this is a very demanding specification, but it sort of miraculously works out. So there is a positive effect on false positives. There's a positive effect on false positives. Nothing before, nothing before. Same thing with linear. There's a true positives on kernels, but nothing on the judicial inefficiency. And now here you have no pre-trends whatsoever, which is quite clean. All right. So the next thing I wanted to show is the size of the effects. So are these effects big or small? Well, of course, glass is always full or half empty, and I'm not sure whether a big one would be good here or a small one. It sort of shakes your confidence in human nature. Well, not if you had any confidence. Perhaps you didn't. You're economists after all. So what we do is we take various different specifications. Actually, that's why I went to the municipality ones, because I thought in this table we also did the ones with municipality time trends, but we don't actually. Sorry. Okay. And then we take the various different specifications and we say, if these specifications really capture causal effects, suppose they do. And, here we don't have an experiment, we don't have like a very clean IV, but suppose they do. And let me just sit down to see these numbers so that I don't give you wrong numbers here. And do the following two thought experiments. One thought experiment is, suppose that all of these places were actually led by generals as they were supposed to be, rather than kernels. And the second thought experiment is, suppose, again holding everything else constant, they all had the best judicial inefficiency score in the sample, which is not great in Colombia, as I've mentioned, but it's a big improvement. And in both cases, you get substantial changes. Not crazy. So essentially, as I said, the casualties in this sample window, it's once we narrow it down to the set of municipalities that we have, because we've left out a couple of municipalities, is we have 1185 casualties. And then the second row says, if we did this reducing judicial inefficiency to its minimum value, then instead of 1185, you would have had 1048. So you would have had an 11.5% reduction in false positives. You would not have eliminated them by any means, but still a substantial one. And if you did the same thing, if you switched all of them from kernel to general, you would have had more or less the same magnitude effect, 9% or 10% reduction. It would have been...
How many kernels were there?
Good question. I should know the answer.
How many kernels were there?
Here is the answer to kernels. So about 30% were kernels.
10%, right? 30% is the standard deviation. 30.
Oh, 10%. Sorry, 10% kernels. Right, sure. Thank you. Yes, yes. This is why I can't see it from here. I should look at it from here. Yes, 10% kernels.
90% generals?
Generals. They were all supposed to be led by generals, the brigades. Right, where were we? Okay, here. So, and then this result is remarkably stable, actually, quantitatively. So, if you do the linear specification, again, you get 11%, now a little bit larger. Actually, with casualties, you get a little bit smaller with judicial. You go to 10%, but slightly larger with the kernel effects. And then if you put the post trends again, it's around 10%. So these are not huge numbers. So you're not ending up with, I think, what would be somewhat unrealistic conclusions that all of these false positives would be eliminated, but they are still pretty substantial. So I have 10, 15 minutes left. So there are a lot of robustness checks here. Let me not go through them in great detail because none of them change anything substantial. So for example, here you include a quartic in population rather than just linear control for population. You get rid of outliers. That doesn't change anything. The lack of pretrends continues. The effects are exactly what they should be. True positives, you get rid of, you don't get rid of the main effects of incentives, but the judicial inefficiency remains. This is a raised question. So here you control fully, flexibly, not just for guerrilla paramilitary, but also unemployment trends. Nothing changes. Again, you can see no pre-trends, just the effects as should be. And then when you look at true positives, again, the incentive effects continue to remain, but no judicial inefficiency effects. These are the municipality pre-trends, and we do a bunch of other things. Oh, one other specification, which is not theoretically advised, but still some people want to see it. So I'm reporting it. So you control flexibly on the right-hand side for true positives and say, perhaps false positives is just collateral damage, in which case if I control for, despite this sort of different interactions and the case study evidence, you may not be convinced that it's not collateral damage. So what we do is that we control for a quartic of true positives and flexibly by time on the right-hand side, and it has absolutely no effect. And that should not be very surprising because you were seeing, false positives go up, true positives go down as a time series, and the cross-sectional variation is a little bit more complex, but it's really not doing that much. So again, no pre-trends, and the effects of both the inefficiency of the judiciary and incentives coming through kernels are there. All right. Finally, the perils of top-down state building. So one story you might have might be, look, this was very distasteful. It's 1,100 innocent lives being lost. But perhaps this was the only way of doing it. You have to break eggs to make omelets, and you have to be a realist. And if the price of, I'm certainly not arguing that, but one could argue, and I've heard this argument, if the price of bringing order and getting rid of FARC, which kills lots of people, kidnaps lots of people, was to create some collateral damage, and if some of that collateral damage was, more collateral than you might have originally anticipated, so be it. This is how you fight guerrilla. This is exactly what you hear in Sri Lanka against their fights against the Tamils, in Turkey against the army's fights against the Kurds. In Egypt against the Islamic extremists and so on and so forth. So perhaps you have to be very tough, and if some civilians get killed, so that's the price. But that argument would have a lot of force if we actually saw that things improve. If the guerrilla get weaker, if law and order gets better established, and so on. But actually what I'm going to show you is that in places where you had more of this stuff happening, you had exactly the opposite take place. So actually law and order further broke down in places where the incentives were stronger and so on. So here is the regression, very simple. Since now I'm using judiciary as an outcome, I just look at kernels. And I looked at judicial inefficiency now as a time-varying variable at first. And what you see is that the overall quality of the judicial inefficiency starts deteriorating during this window. And a little bit after also. So it's a persistent effect. These are not totally significant, but they are positive, similar magnitude, and hovering around significance. So essentially what's going on, at least in the data, is that in places where you have the kernels leading, so this is where the sort of really some very weird things started happening, overall judiciary started functioning very much less well either. So one sort of story for this, we don't have a smoking gun, is that the military was putting a lot of pressure on this police force and other bureaucratic institutions to just play by their rules. But you might say, well, there might be lots of other things going on. Still, perhaps the security situation improved. But here is the real weird stuff. These are supposed to be very successful fights against the guerrilla. But actually, in the places where it was going on, the guerrilla got stronger. So the guerrilla presence is positive, and actually differently from the other ones, it actually persistently so. It doesn't even go away. The guerrilla becomes stronger in places where they're supposed to be fought more vigorously. And here is the next weird thing. The paramilitaries, which were not fought at all, but were often in cahoots with the army in doing this. The paramilitary may have done some of the killings of the civilians and given it because in exchange for these illicit covert funds. Actually, they get stronger too. So these are the paramilitaries and their presence and their attacks against civilians increase. Sorry, this is a guerrilla presence, and also there is an attack variable. So, therefore, what I want to say, is this is not a conclusive case, of course, but it does indicate why one of the mechanisms that I suggested, which is that if you just give preeminence and overwhelming emphasis on building military control, when the state actually is, of course, a multidimensional object, and all of these dimensions themselves are weak, in particular the judiciary is weak, rule of law is non-existent, might actually backfire because the military objectives often come into conflict with all these other nice things that we associate with state capacity, public goods, conflict resolution, better ability to regulate and monitor economic activity, and so on and so forth. So I think it obviously does not prove the case that this will always happen, and I have not even claimed that there will be cases where perhaps this can be avoided, but there are these tendencies for, first of all, not making this whole exercise a very easy one, collateral damage, literal or figurative included, but also actually weakening the very other dimensions that you might want to have. That, the reason why we want state capacity is not because we want jackboots on the ground, but we want, public good provision, and we want courts that function, and we want regulation of economic activity so that, powerful economic interests cannot act as monopsonies or humiliate and intimidate their way into sort of economic proeminence. But those are essentially the roles that become even harder perhaps to develop, at least in the medium term, when there is a very top-down and violence-based expansion of the state. So I think this is a good time for me to sort of ask whether there are any questions between from not just today, but perhaps from all 3 days, because I think we did not have much of a time to discuss any questions at the end of either. Yes, please.
Yeah, I was wondering why. Thank you. I was wondering why monarchies, especially in the Middle East, seem to be a lot more stable than any other form of government.
Great question. I don't know. So, well, I mean, I know in the sense that I know one set of answers that have been suggested, which would be superficially consistent with what I'm talking about here. It's just that I find it a little puzzling. I mean, so the explanation that has been suggested, and essentially what am I, so let me put what I've said here so far in a different language. I'm not sure whether I like this language or I feel a little bit of a loose language, but if I put it in this way, you'll recognize it. Is that in the, let me just, to do this, let me go to the beginning. Okay, I was going to come to that last thing later, but so the reason why here, for example, Region 1, you have that state, these potential proto-state builders are being stopped is because they are viewed as not to have any legitimacy. So if you were the legitimate ruler, then I may not mind you having power. That sort of is a different language for saying. So the story goes at some level that I've heard mentioned is that somehow monarchies have the legitimacy that generals don't. So Mubarak doesn't have legitimacy because everybody sees him as a corrupt general who put on a suit. Abdullah al-Salah and Bashar al-Assad don't have legitimacy. But the Kuwaiti, Moroccan, or the Saudi family have legitimacy. And that's why those regimes are more stable. Now the problem is that, does the Saudi family really have legitimacy? I don't know. It has some legitimacy because of the support of the Wahhabis, and it's been sort of associated with Abdulaziz, etc., going back, you know. But on the other hand, there are a lot of people that argue they don't have a legitimacy within Saudi Arabia. So I think it's not a black and white, but that might be the explanation. But if that's the case, why is it that, you know, once you call yourself a king, which is what Abdulaziz did, you gain legitimacy. But when you call yourself a liberator like Nasser did, you don't gain, or your followers don't gain legitimacy. I don't know. There's some interesting questions. It's a great question to think more about. Yes, please.
So I have kind of two related questions. So the first one is, so from your results, do you see that a top-down state building is not possible in general? Or might it be that the prerequisite in those states was wrong for that? Or either it was done in the wrong way? And from that question, so I read from some people that suggested in this kind of the refugee crisis that billionaires were suggesting to buy land, and in that new land set up a new state for the refugees. How do you see the chances that something like that would work?
Well, let me answer your first question, which I'm thinking in a slightly better position to answer. So in fact, here I'm not making as strong a claim as that it will always be impossible. But I think if you dig deeper, the claim is a little bit more nuanced. So if you look at these paths here, you know, they were put there with a purpose. This one goes all the way to the maximum state capacity, and this one doesn't. It just curves back down to somewhere in the middle. So one difference between these paths is that there are benefits to have state capacity to everybody. So this was the question I was saying. Which dictator, which ruler doesn't want to have as much capacity as possible? But those benefits are overwhelmed by other considerations. But what that suggests is that when those benefits are really high, then you are going to go almost all the way to the top. And one set of conditions in which the state capacity benefits are really large is, for example, defensive. So when you are building the state and your very survival, perhaps like the Prussians against the French, or South Koreans against the threat of communism from North Korea, depend on the survival of the state, its ability to be able to deliver services, and its ability to be able to field an army, then, you know, whatever the risks are and whatever the difficulties are, you're actually going to make much more of an effort to build it. So that could be one. On the refugee crisis, I mean, I think, you know, what I'm saying here has very little relevance. I mean, I think it's actually a really interesting idea that, you know, there are lots of places in the world, even in Europe, which are empty, and people can go and build their own construction and their own cities. So you have an immediate employment program also. So perhaps it's not a crazy idea. Yes, Rick? Sorry. Yeah. Right. Yes. Yes. You got the privilege.
Bit of forward planning. No. I mean, one thing that's missing from your picture seems to be the presence of the media and you know, journalism and so on. And there's data, I take it, on sort of persecution of the media, the extent to which the media controlled and stuff. So there could be correlations.
Absolutely. So I think the cross-country correlation is very much in line with that. When the media is prosecuted, it becomes much harder to do all of these good things. And media prosecution is also very systematically related to what there's a dictator and what the dictator is trying to do, whether it's trying to hide things. There's also this very acute evidence about, you know, the role of media in various different places. One that comes one from from a paper by Macmillan and Zoido. It was a very simple, like one-fact paper, but they looked at these secret files that were made by Montesinos, Fujimori's chief of security or whatever. You know, he was a very number-proof, powerful person, and under Fujimori's, you know, iron grip authoritarian rule, he was also charged with buying a lot of people to support, and he was such a suspicious person that he actually made tapes of all of the transactions. So that we have a very good data. And one of the good data is who he bought and how much he bought them for. And one of the things that's sort of really amazing is that at the end he turned up to pay 10 times as much for journalists as Supreme Court judges or top members of Senate or Congress, because in his mind they were much more dangerous and valuable to buy. So, yes, David.
Okay, I have two comments. One is, you know, maybe things didn't go right with this military build-up here, because you started off with a very fractionalized state with civil war. So, you know, I could do devil's advocate and say maybe in other situations, empowering the military and giving them high-powered incentives would work. And, you know, maybe that's the case of what happened in South Korea. You know, after a while they gave up, but, you know, maybe that worked there. And related to my other ideas, you know, my other comment is, you know, you say, you know, the key thing is, you know, state capacity is multidimensional, so maybe it went wrong here because they invested everything in building up the military. So is the solution building up everything else or building up something else of all these dimensions? So you could think, you know, some states were successful maybe in building up just one other dimension, which is the fiscal dimension. That could be England, you know, think about Brewer. That could be China, think about their you know, good civil servant system. So what would be the answer there?
Yeah. So I think those are both excellent questions, comments. And the first one is absolutely. I think if the military was more reliable and was more under control, things would have gotten better. And I think the 10% number that I gave you from those back-of-the-envelope calculations is certainly a lower bound on how much better these things would have been. I think if the military was better, if it was under better judicial control, you know, it will have gone better. Would it have gone perfectly well? I don't know. I think there are other things that suggest that, you know, qualitative evidence, but some empirical evidence we're working on, that, you know, there will be other difficulties of these top-down approaches, but certainly you're absolutely right to a first order that the reason why these top-down approaches, we argue, and I think in reality go so badly, is because they are happening in a vacuum, institutional vacuum, and they are happening led by a military that itself is a very bad actor because it's not under control. South Korea went well, partly because the South Korean military was very much under U.S. control. So at every stage they were under, you know, prodding and control of the U.S. And the South Korean military showed its true colors in many instances. One of them was immediately when the students and the trade unionists started agitating in the 1980s for democracy. South Korean military, as you would expect from most militaries, first killed a lot of them and then imprisoned the rest. And then the U.S. said, no, if you keep on doing this, we're not going to support you. This, you know, we can't. This is bad for our image and everything. And then they had an about turn, and then they sort of became more permissive, and then that's when the military regime collapsed. So I think again a top-down, without U.S. South Korean path would have been very different, is probably my guess. So the second question. So you know, let me answer your question somewhat indirectly in the following way, which is, remember what I've argued. I've argued that I've not. So here is a different way of arguing my point. That you've asked your question as if there's a better engineering solution. And my answer is all of these engineering solutions are problematic. So where instead I'm not suggesting an engineering solution, what I'm suggesting is, well, if you can manage to be either by luck or perhaps by, you know, just some other circumstances in this region, the way that state capacity is going to get built is that it's going to co-evolve together with the control of society over state capacity. And how that dynamics would go, it's not clear, but it will probably be different precisely because there has to be a give and take process. So it's not just going to be military control, but if you're going to do military control, you also have to provide public goods. you perhaps also have to provide some type of conflict resolution, but not the ones that the society at this point doesn't want. So in other words, that's why I don't think I can give you a direct answer that this is the formula that you use, this is the combination you should do, because which combination society will tolerate and will want probably will differ from society to society, and probably the best way of doing it is to ask civil society itself, which here means get them involved in this process. But yeah. Yes, Rick?
So where would Roma charter cities fit into your diagram?
Well, again, I mean, I think just like the previous question on buying cities, I don't think anything I've said here is super relevant to that. There are other considerations. I guess Romer's charter cities have two aspects. One is that we can have these charter cities that are great, that have better state capacity because they are administered by Norwegians and they are going to have good property rights and good legal codes, etc. I'm totally willing to believe that. B, which is the part I'm not willing to believe, that these things, A, will last and will become a beacon of hope in the middle of the desert. No, I don't think so. Because first of all, the lasting part, you can only last if you're in the middle of Madagascar or Honduras, against the Madagascar or the Honduras government and elite or whoever is going to be politically powerful after the next coup, whatever, wants to tolerate you. And B, the beacon of hope, that presumes that somehow, people in Madagascar or Mozambique or Angola are totally unaware that their problems come from civil war or corrupt politicians or lack of representation. I think they all know that. If you go and talk to them, they all know that. It's just they don't have any way of creating something better. So just by having a charter city there and have that as a beacon of hope, I don't think it's going to change that greatly. Yes, please.
You already mentioned about the role of the US military in South Korea. If you look at Germany after the Second World War, so what type of lessons would you draw from that?
Well, I think it's very similar. I think it's very similar. Both cases was heavy involvement with civil society, playing to the strength of the state. South Korea, for example, the German case, I'm not going to comment that much on. People here know it much better than I do. Davide can correct me, and I don't want to be corrected by him. But if you look at South Korea, South Korean state was very weak in some dimensions, strong in others. It had an imperial bureaucracy. It had some tradition of state efficiency. On the other hand, very low education, very low ability to provide public goods, no sort of judicial system. So these were, that they played to the strength of the state, but then also strengthened these other dimensions. But they stayed there for a long time, as they did in Germany. Not everything in Germany, may have gone well. So, there's this recent paper, although, I'm not sure what to think of it, but by Hans-Joachim Voth and Nico Voigtlander. Did I pronounce that right? Okay. It's a series of papers. They have very nice on sort of the origins of Nazis, etc. I like their earlier papers very, very much. This last one, I'm still sort of not 100% sure, but what they claim is that the denazification program did not work very well. And then their evidence is that in places where there was more intensive denazification efforts, actually the share of extremist parties in later elections that was actually higher or not lower, and a bunch of other evidence like that. But I think there are other sort of things that might be more complicated in the context. But it certainly went against my sort of prior in that even that I had told previously that had gone reasonably well. But it might have been that some aspects of it have backfired, but they stayed here for long enough, and the strength of certain aspects of German bureaucracy and civil society were strong enough that once they had the support, I guess they flourished. But again, I think there are better, more informed people on this to answer that question here. Perhaps they'll give the answer. But
so there seems to be some randomness where a country starts on the graph. So I was wondering, why do we then see region 1 states or region 2 states clustering geographically? Like region 2 states, they're in Europe, you know, region 1 states maybe in Africa. So why do they cluster?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, I mean, I think one thing I did not say, but was sort of implicit, is that, you know, essentially what I'm taking it for granted is that all states, all societies start somewhere around here. So nobody starts here or nobody starts here. They all start from here, and then imagine, you know, and then actually this figure was drawn by my RA. I should have drawn it, but I asked him to draw it, and I described it to him. And one thing, he drew it perfectly, but one thing he didn't draw it the way I wanted it, and I was just too, I didn't want to go back to him, is that I really wanted this region to be much more of a sliver. So to emphasize that region 2 is actually a narrow region. So what I wanted to emphasize is that, you know, there are small differences that matter here. But those small differences do exist. So, you know, the way that, for example, geographically, economically, and historically, sub-Saharan Africa developed, you know, did not have, you know, many durable, you know, centralized polities before the modern age. Whereas, you know, Europe had the Roman Empire, which collapsed. It had the church. It had the conflict between the church and emperor. So perhaps those things and the fact that there were already some states that flourished both during in the Dark Ages and then in its immediate aftermath meant that there was a little bit more of this strength of the state and city, and so perhaps they're a little bit like here, whereas there are other societies that are here or here, and then that small differences create a difference. But I don't, at this point, and hopefully not very far in the future, I don't intend to give a very complete answer about exactly, you know, where society started in the Neolithic Revolution, but although some people are trying to do that sort of exercise also.
You mentioned the example of Lebanon, where there are these 18 groups that do not want to have any particular group to have particular strong power, and so the state remains weak. Now, in Europe, we have even more groups. We try to build up the European Union. And, of course, the question is, how can we do that such that there is a mechanism that punishes those who get too strong power, like you mentioned the example yesterday with old Athens?
Yes, that's a good question. I mean, of course, we're just like Lebanon, right? I was complaining that the Lebanese parliament is ineffective, doesn't do anything. Policing is done by the 18 communities themselves. They provide the public goods. Well, that's just like Europe. But, you know, the surprising thing is that Europe does not have the power to do any of that anyway. It's an umbrella organization, whereas the Lebanese state, as a state, should, at least in international law, has the freedom to go into each region and send its you know, police there or etc. But it's still incapable of doing. I think that's a very important point that you're raising. And my answer is the following. Look, it's a very simple answer, but I think it probably has some truth to it, which is that when you have relatively less complex production structure, less globalized economy, then the economy is defined sub-nationally. It's Munich, Frankfurt, they communicate, that's it. Then the state is the right sort of unit to regulate that economic activity. But then the economy becomes much more global. Some international relations become very important, including the potential of war or other sort of conflict resolution. Well, the national state, nation state, may not be well placed. It cannot do the regulation of economic activity. That's when you're trying to form these umbrella organizations, but you have exactly the same the issues that you've pointed out. A, those things don't really have the authority because they can't force anybody to do anything. And a lot of the power is still with the nation state, so you have this tension, and it's not an easy tension to resolve. You know, the way that the US resolved it after the Articles of Confederation is exactly say, okay, fine, you can keep some of that power, but we're going to centralize a lot of the military power and to some degree the fiscal power, although they did that very incompletely, in order to make the umbrella organization more than an umbrella, to have the actual implementation power. But, you know, Europe's not going to do anytime soon. It's not going to enable military unity. Hans Werner might have different opinions on this, but I don't think most European countries are ready for having a sort of a military union. The question is, how far can you go towards banking regulation and fiscal sort of coordination and union without having the military union? I don't know. All right. Well, Hans Werner also tells me to conclude, so let me conclude. So I think the only thing I want to say is this was what. Well, this was my last slide, but yeah. Except I don't know what. All right, so my German is not enough, so thank you. Which is, it's been great to visit here, and I was really touched by the reception, and it's a great honor to be able to sort of be here for these lectures and get this very prestigious award. So, and thanks for all the great questions and the participation and the discussion. So, thank you. And I can even hold the book. You get it.
Yeah, and it's not only you thank us, we have to thank you much more for these wonderful lectures. A new world of thinking, state formation, state creation. The last question reminded us that in Europe we are also in a process where this information is extremely important for the future. And you showed us how to do it in practical terms. We were discussing it all the time, but here we have an apparatus, a machinery, game theory combined with wonderful econometrics and a careful description of the actual situation. I find this fascinating, and I must say it was rewarding, and I learned a lot from your lectures. Now, there's a little gift I want to give you.
I have to learn too, so that's my learning. And I'll be examined on this when I return back.
Yeah, the last chapter is has a little bit of overlapping because it talks about the future of Europe, what we can learn from America's state building, and it brings us to this question. So for you it may be all trivial, but
no, absolutely not.
For me, it is a new dimension in which I would like to think. If only I had the ability to do that in a careful way as you do it. But
this book looks pretty careful.
Some people have to walk on foot and try what they can do. So all the best for the future, and I hope we stay in contact.
Of course.
And this is not a gift. This is something. This is a bargain because we expect a book from you.
Okay.
And there has to be the book of these wonderful lectures.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you.